It's good to have the opportunity to share from God's Word as well. And, it's amazing how God works all these things out. You never know how these things will do. I'm probably a lot less planned than I should be, and that's not always a good thing, but God works these things out. And so I'm thankful that we had the opportunity to be here and to fill in. And that it all worked out so far. One other thing I was just thinking about that I didn't mention, I'm so thankful for my parents and the impact that they had on our lives, just challenging us. They always encouraged us to serve God now. And I know you all as teenagers are here tonight. It is not too early to serve God because it gets harder. Even as adults, when you can really evaluate your spiritual life and you think, man, I've got so much more to improve on, it's not always easy to change. You get set in your ways. The younger you are when you determine to serve God with your life, the better. And I'm thankful for my parents who encouraged us to be in God's Word, to be studying His Word, to be serving, to be living the gospel. And we didn't always do so well. We were called the unruly boys sometimes, and we still get that today. But it was my parents' influence that really made a big difference in our lives and challenged us to serve Him. They always told us, it would be the greatest honor that we could have that you would serve Christ with your life in whatever capacity. And by God's grace, we're doing that today, all 5 of us Ruley boys. And that's to His grace. It doesn't mean that we can't fall. It doesn't mean that we're perfect. But we thank Jesus Christ and His work in our hearts and the Holy Spirit for just continuing to lead us and us being sensitive to that. My parents have never been on a mission trip until right now. They had never been out of the country, and they're actually visiting my brother Dwight in Morocco. They just got there today. They're going to be there for 2 weeks, and that's really special. We're very thankful for that. We're really encouraging them to do that because they have never seen the fruit of what God was doing other than seeing us go off to the mission field. So we're thankful for the ability that they have to be on the mission field. And, it isn't just about being a missionary. You can serve God in a lot of other capacities. My brother David is in Uganda. My brother Dwight is in Morocco. But I also have 2 other brothers that aren't as much in the ministry, if you will. They're not missionaries. I have a brother Peter who's teaching at a Christian school down in Miami, but he's doing a great job. He's being a good mentor and teacher for the students down there. And then my youngest brother is actually going to law school. So figure that one out. We go from missionary, Christian school teacher, law school. But God has given him a lot of unique opportunities as well. He really has a heart for service. He really has a heart for Christ. And he's really good at what he does. This summer, he's actually going to be spending 6 weeks working in Marco Rubio's office in Washington, D.C. As an intern, which is a pretty neat thing. We have no idea what the political process is going to be, but he has an opportunity to have an influence in Washington, D.C. Last summer, he worked for the Family Research Council in Washington. So God has given him a unique ministry as well. Serving Christ isn't just being in full-time Christian service. It's having a heart for Him in whatever capacity you do. So I challenge you, young people, prepare your heart now to serve Christ, and He will use you in whatever capacity He sees fit, but it's a preparation now. And for you all that have others below you that you can influence, you can have a huge impact in their life. Obviously, my relationship with Pastor Whitmer and others has been a testimony to that. I'm so thankful for those things. I want to share with you something that God has burdened my heart for and really has taught us, or something that we're learning from Scripture. I quoted from Philippians earlier, and I'd like you to turn to Philippians chapter 4. I wish I had a lot more time to share from this passage because it's a passage that I've had a good opportunity to study. The book of Philippians is a wonderful book. It's been a book that I've gone to over and over again. Ultimately, when you look at the book of Philippians, you see a lot about maturity. Ultimately, Paul is talking to a church that he had a personal relationship with, really a missionary relationship with. This was a church that he founded in suffering. If you think back to the book of Acts, you see a church that really was founded quickly, and it was founded in suffering. You see Paul coming into the town of Philippi. You see Lydia, who was saved down at the river. You see Paul and Silas seeing this demonic girl who was fortune-telling. They saved her. Ultimately, she got saved, and they cast the demon out of her, and they ended up being thrown in prison. But seeing themselves in prison, they were rejoicing. They were praising God. There was an earthquake. We see the Philippian jailer being saved, and then they had to leave. And that was it. That's what we know about the beginning of the Philippian church. But we do know that they suffered. They were willing to sacrifice for the cause of Christ. And ultimately, they were willing to give themselves sacrificially for the sake of the gospel and ultimately for the sake of Paul as well. Paul is writing the book of Philippians to challenge this church, not a perfect church, but a church that was close to his heart because they gave to him. They cared about him. He had a personal relationship that had been founded in suffering. And he shares with them different aspects of Christian maturity, what a mature believer looks like. And he challenges them to be mature in their faith. It seems that they had a problem with disunity, of having fighting among themselves. He goes to the point where in Philippians chapter 4, he actually calls out 2 women in the church who were fighting. It would be kind of embarrassing, right? Imagine if Pastor Whitmer just started naming names, right? I know you guys have problems. Let's get it fixed right down here, you know. That's what Paul did. It was a problem, and he was going to address it. But this was a church that had a servant's heart. This was a church that had a giving heart. And Paul's heart for them comes out here at the end of the book of Philippians. You know, maturity, Christian maturity is something that is very important as believers, but it's something that is rarely attained. You know, even human maturity doesn't always exist, right? We like to think of ourselves as mature adults because we've lived enough years, right? We've gained enough experience, but just because you grow older doesn't mean that you're actually mature as a human being, right? There's a lot of young people my age in their 30s who are very immature. They're not responsible. They're not taking life seriously. My mom used to always say, you're only young once, but you can be immature for a lifetime, right? Totally true. Maybe we have an entire generation like that that is immature. But even worse is to be a believer who's been saved for so many years, but is not developing maturity in their lives, going through hardship, doing the hard things, acting like Jesus Christ would want us to act. Paul, through his experience as a Christian, through his experience as a missionary, had learned maturity, and he wanted to pass on some of those characteristics. He talked about joy. He talked about unity. He talked about suffering. And here in this passage at Philippians chapter 4, we're just going to look at verses 10 through 13. He talks about a concept, contentment. Contentment is an important concept. It's not a concept that we hear that much about. But as mature believers, we must learn to be content in every circumstance. Paul gives us an example of this here in the book of Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Let's just read the passage and then we'll kind of break it down and talk a little bit about contentment. Paul says, "But I rejoice in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." If we look at verse 10, we kind of get the context of what Paul is talking about here. Here, as he comes to the very end of the book of Philippians, he addresses one of his main reasons for writing this book to the Philippian believers. He had served his ministry career here as he writes Philippians. He is in jail. He is close to the end of his life. He is, in a way, reminiscing about his life. But he's been in jail. He's been suffering. And he receives a gift from the Philippian church. And he's writing to thank them. He says, "I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity." Paul, if we look back at the history, and we don't have time to, I wish I could share with you all the way through verse 20, and I have another message that talks about this. Their relationship had gone all the way back. Right after Paul had left Philippi, they began to send him money gifts because they cared about him. They had such a deep bond, a spiritual bond. They began to support him, to give him regular gifts. And for some reason over time, those gifts had stopped. But here they are in prison. They heard that he had a need, and they gave to him again. And Paul says, man, I was so thankful to receive the gift. Not necessarily because I needed the money, because it reminds me that you guys still love me. You guys still remember me. You guys still care about me. And I'm thankful for that. But he goes on, he says in verse 11, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Paul wanted the Philippians to realize he was very thankful for their gift. He was very thankful for the support that they gave him. But he had learned to be content in every circumstance. I'm not here to talk about money today, but I think we want to narrow in on this concept of contentment, what Paul means by this, what his example means, and what we can learn by this concept of contentment. First of all, when we think about contentment, there's a lot of things we could talk about from Scripture. We're going to keep ourselves in this passage, but I think we need to understand what contentment is not, first of all, before we can define what contentment is. The dictionary definition of contentment is a satisfaction with one's possessions or circumstances. You know, for most people, contentment is Friday has finished. I'm done with my job. I get to sit back in my chair with, for Pastor Wimmer, it's a chocolate milk still, right? Yes, I remember that. My wife loves chocolate milk too. Whatever you love, you get to sit back and relax, and life is good, right? The problems are gone. The bills are paid. The kids are in bed. Whatever the case may be, you know, you're on your boat. Whatever the case may be, contentment is when everything is going right with the world. That's the natural definition that we think of. But that's not biblical contentment because, you know, life changes, right? Once we reach the priorities in our life, once things, you know, we have goals and we reach those goals, life's kind of boring, right? So we got to have new goals. We have to have new things that we're reaching out for. We're not easily content as human beings. That's our natural tendency. So in a way, that definition of contentment is very subjective. It's based on the circumstances of where I live in. You know, often we use contentment as maybe an excuse for mediocrity. I fall into this trap sometimes. You know, I'm content with the way I am. Just leave me alone, right? I don't need to change. Don't bother me. Everything's okay. Leave me alone. Often we are content with who we are as people instead of growing in our maturity, both as individual human beings and also in our spiritual life. But this idea of contentment, when the Philippians heard this from Paul, they very likely thought immediately of the philosophical concept of Stoicism. And I think I might have lost half of you when I said that. Stoicism, you're like, oh no, I came here for Wednesday night and I'm kind of dead and I don't want to talk about philosophy. I don't want to be like, you know, school's out for the summer. I don't want to think about that. But I think it's important that we understand perhaps what they were talking about and it will make this painless. The idea of Stoicism, Stoicism was an ancient philosophy that encouraged man to understand the natural order of the universe and to seek to positively accept that order. A Stoic was typically reserved and unattached, so as not to be dependent emotionally or physically on anything. A Stoic ultimately focuses on his inner abilities and resources to combat any challenge. So ultimately, a Stoic is one who is depending on himself. There's a certain aspect of self-reliance. I can take care of myself. I can handle anything that comes my way. Unfortunately, this concept is very common in our world, but it's rooted in pride. And the reality of life is that life will break you. You cannot be completely self-reliant. The circumstances of life will break you. The relationships that you have in life will let you down. The things that you think will make you happy do not satisfy. So ultimately, contentment can't completely be self-reliance. So what is biblical contentment? Let's define it and let's look at what Paul says about this. The Holman Dictionary defines contentment as an internal satisfaction which does not demand changes in external circumstances. This is closely akin to the idea of joy, which is another major theme of Philippians. Ultimately, it's an attitude. It's something from within. It's an attitude that says, no matter what comes my way, no matter what the circumstances are around me, I am going to be content. J.I. Packer says that contentment is essentially a matter of accepting from God's hand what He sends because we know that He is good and therefore it is good. Contentment is a uniquely Christian virtue that is difficult but essential for a mature believer to attain. Ultimately, as believers, we're very easily discontent. We look at the circumstances around us. We look at the way life is going, and we're troubled. We're careful. We're concerned. We're worried. But Christ wants us to be content. Paul's challenge to the Philippians was that they be content. So let's look at 3 aspects of contentment that Paul highlights in this passage, and we'll do this quickly. First of all, this contentment was something that Paul had learned through the experiences of his life. Look at verses 11 and 12. Paul says, "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need." Notice what Paul says in verse 11. He says, "I have learned in whatsoever state, in any circumstances of life, to be content." Paul had gone through lots of different circumstances, and the reality is that we all go through ups and downs in life, but the end result for Paul had been contentment. Well, that's not necessarily natural. Life will break you. Things are not going to go your way, and most of us are discontent. So there's got to be something a little bit more to that than just, I just went through life and I just learned to be content. I decided to be content. So we got to go a little further here. In verse 12, Paul uses another word that I think gives us a little more detail than just that simple learning, the idea of learning from a classroom or learning from experience. Notice in verse 12, at the middle there, Paul says, "In all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need." It's interesting, that word instructed there. This word was often used in biblical Greek to describe the idea of being initiated into a society. Perhaps you've had this experience in life. You've wanted to join some sort of group, and there's an initiation process that you have to go through in order to join, right? Maybe it was a society in college. Maybe it was something at work. Maybe it was a special club or group. There's some sort of hoop you have to jump through. Hopefully it's something nice. In college it was something stupid. You had to go jump in the lake in the freezing cold or drink something, or some other group that may be more serious what you have to do in order to join. But there are certain qualifications. There is a certain level of trust that you have to put in the group in order to join, right? You basically give yourself up and you say, I want to join this group, and no matter what it takes, I'm going to do it because I'm going to join this group, right? Essentially what Paul is saying in this concept when he says, I am being instructed, he say, I have given my life over to Jesus Christ, and through my knowledge of him, he has instructed me how to be content. He has essentially been my initiator into this unique mindset, this unique attitude of being content. The world is not content. The world is looking for something better all the time. But as believers, contentment is a unique virtue because it is something that we can only learn through Jesus Christ, through our dependence upon him. Paul was content because of his dependence upon Christ. But notice he continues on. Not only is contentment something that has to be learned, and it's learned through our relationship with Jesus Christ and through our dependence on him. Secondly, contentment is something that requires flexibility. It requires not looking at the circumstances around us. Look at verse 12. Paul says, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. It's interesting here, Paul talks about the ups and downs of his life. We all have ups and downs in our life, but maybe we haven't experienced the highs and lows that Paul experienced in his life. He talks about the idea of abounding. He talks about, twice in that verse, in verse 12, he uses that word. Really, that has the idea of having everything you could possibly need. There's two ways of looking at this. If you look all the way back to Paul's life before he was a believer, and in fact, Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, Paul describes his life before he was a believer. Paul came from a good background. Very likely he came from a wealthy home. He was well educated, and it took money in that day for him to be trained the way he was. He was a prestigious figure. He worked hard in what he did. He was a religious leader. People valued him as a person. They looked up to him. Really, he was a leader in training before the Damascus Road incident where he was converted and God completely changed him. But guaranteed in that life, he had everything that he needed. He knew what it was like to be wealthy, to be well taken care of. It could be referring to that when he talks about the fact that he abounds. He knows what it's like to abound, to have everything he needs. It could also be something he's referencing in verse 18. Notice what he says. He's speaking here from prison. He says, "But I have all and abound." Paul knew what it was like to have his daily needs met as a believer. Even in prison, because the Philippians had provided for him, he had enough food, he had enough clothing, he had all that he needed. He knew what it was like to have his needs provided for. But he also had experienced deprivation as well. Paul says, "I know how to abound, but I also know how to be abased." It's interesting, that word, the idea there is the idea of being humiliated like a beggar. You know, in the United States today, we don't have to beg for our food. We don't have to beg for help, right? We kind of look down at people that beg on the street corners or even people that ask you for help. We don't want to ask for help. In a way, that kind of shows our self-reliance in a way. But we don't like to ask for help. We think we can do it on our own. Imagine having to beg. You're so desperate. You don't have enough food. You don't have enough money. You've got to beg for help. That's what Paul is talking about here. He had experienced great need. He had suffered need. He had been abased. Paul had experienced both sides in his life. Serious persecution, suffering, shipwreck. He'd been beaten. But notice what he says, "I have learned to be content," in verse 11. It wasn't based on circumstances. Paul's attitude was no matter what life threw his way, he was going to be content. Paul's contentment did not fluctuate based on the situations he was in. Paul's contentment was grounded in the reality that God was in control of every situation. And that leads us to our final idea here. Ultimately, contentment is something that we learn through our relationship with Jesus Christ. Contentment is something that is not dependent on the circumstances around it. It's not looking at the big picture in our environment, but it's based on our attitude and our relationship with Christ. But ultimately, contentment is dependent on our relationship, our dependence upon Christ. Notice what Paul says, verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." You know, we've heard that verse so many times. You probably heard a dozen messages on that verse. Probably rarely have you heard it preached in this context and in this idea of contentment here. Often this verse is abused to basically say, I can do whatever I want to do because God will help me, right? It's not necessarily the case. Here Paul is saying, I can be content because Christ strengtheneth me. When he says, I can do all things, if you look back, he's talking about the difficult circumstances in his life. He's talking about the good circumstances in his life. He's talking about his service for Christ. He said, you know, I can suffer. I can have everything I need. I can serve Christ with my life because Jesus Christ strengthens me. I'm capable of having contentment because Jesus Christ strengthened me. You know, we often think of this verse as, you know, I can do this or that. I can accomplish goals for myself. But I think the more powerful idea we have here is Paul says, you know, I can be a mature believer. One of those aspects of maturity is contentment. In a world that is discontent, in a world that is dissatisfied, in a world that is full of despair, I can be content in every circumstance because Christ strengtheneth me. Paul's dependence was on Christ. He recognized that Christ was the only one that could make him the mature believer that he wanted to be, that God wanted him to be. Paul's contentment was powered by his dependence on Christ and not in his dependence on himself. Though this verse does refer to dependence on Christ to do impossible things, I believe that contentment is one of those impossible things. Being like Christ, that's an impossible thing, right? But through Jesus Christ, through his blood on the cross, through our relationship with him, we can be like Christ. Christ was a picture of contentment. And Paul here at the end of his life is saying, wow, you know, I'm so thankful for your giving to me, but Christ has taught me to be content and not to ask for more than he can give to me. That's an amazing testimony. Let's take just a moment and apply contentment. You know, when we think of contentment, we first of all think of the material aspects. You know, we live in a world that wants stuff, right? We all want stuff. We've got our Amazon order, wish lists. We've got our, things that, I'd like to have this or that. We all, just because we aren't kids doesn't mean we don't have Christmas lists, all those kind of things. We want stuff. Try moving to a foreign country and you only have 20 suitcases to take with you. And you think, I'm not materialistic. And then you have to get rid of stuff. It's not very easy. It's hard. We love our stuff, right? But I think as believers, it's easiest for us to realize the follies of materialism. This stuff won't last. The things that we invest our time in, we need to be very careful that we're investing in eternity as well, that we don't value things so much that we push Jesus Christ to the side. That's an easy application to make, but I think a more challenging application to make is when it comes to the circumstances of life. We must also think of contentment in regard to our expectations for life. We often have expectations about the way life should be, and when these expectations are not met, we get frustrated, right? I work hard at my job. I should be promoted, right? That's all I ask. I've taken care of my family. We shouldn't have to ask people to help us out with the groceries. I've worked hard for financial security. I've saved money. Why did this have to happen and now I'm destitute? All I expect is my kids to perform well in school. That's all I ask. We have expectations for life, right? And sometimes when those expectations aren't met, we get discontent. We look to Washington, D.C., and we see things going the way we don't want them to, and we get discontent. We see the way we're relating to our family and our friends, and we get discontent because they don't do what we want us to do. Ultimately, we had expectations when it came to our raising support to go to Brazil. We thought it was going to be fast. We thought people were going to be excited. We were going to get there quickly. But God had bigger plans for us, and I think one of them was teaching us to be patient, teaching us to be content with learning the lessons he wanted us to and trusting in him. And we're more dependent on him now than we were when we started. Don't allow your expectations in life to rob you of your joy. Be content with where God has put you. Trust him that he is putting circumstances in your life for your good. I'll close with these 4 ideas. How do I learn contentment? First of all, consider your daily pursuits. Have they become an insatiable pursuit of personal items and selfish ambition and expectation? Consider your expectations for your life. Do you have unreasonable expectations of a perfect life that leaves no flexible room for God to teach you to depend upon him? Consider your relationship with Christ. The more we go to him in prayer and commit our way to him in every area of life, the more contentment we will find in him. And ultimately remember that contentment is a lifelong process, a process of depending on Christ, recognizing that I can do all things, I can be like Christ, because he strengtheneth me. Hopefully you're challenged by that this evening. We have a lot to learn on that subject, but hopefully you're challenged to be more content, to focus your life on your dependence on Christ and allow him to build that mature attitude of contentment in your heart. I'll turn it over to Pastor.